The following program showcases the opinions of poet Dan Schneider. These views are not necessarily the views of this cable network and should not be considered as such. Please send all correspondence to Gallery 7 at an address to be given following the program.
Things that you want to break down. This is one of the things that with a thing like the list, or the list monthly things, when you expose yourself to different things, when white people meet black people, when young meets old, when gay meets straight, when religious meets non-religious, you get to understand a bit of themselves, of the other side. You know, it's one of the reasons why when I write poetry, I try not to write just from a white male perspective. Often I'll write, you know, I'm one of the few people that
You're white?
Yeah, I'm one of the few people that writes very well in the feminine voice. And you know, there are people that will say, "Oh, you can't write in the feminine voice. You can't write from the gay perspective. You can't write from the black or Chicano or Native American perspective. You know, that's racist. That's misogynist. That's homophobic. That's this, that, another thing." And it's silly. It's just silly. And a lot of people. The list I started in August of '97, and generally history shows that clusters of individuals in various arts get together, and I wanted to help facilitate that a bit. I had organized this Stone Arch Festival in '97 and this year in '98, and I had a lot of numbers. I didn't want to let them go to waste, so I thought it was a good time to try to get people together. And in February, we got a website that you put up, Dylan, and basically it's hopefully one day it'll turn into something maybe like a yellow pages for artists that you know, someone in the area wants to find out, you know, where there's an architect or someone who's a graphic designer or a poet, whether they want to start a group or just meet people of the opposite sex, or connect if you're an actor looking for someone who's a director, just a way for people to connect, and I help facilitate that. And that's basically what it is. There's no fee. It's free. I'm someone who is pretty averse to trying to get money into things. What it does is it lists your name, your telephone number, have a website, an email that'll be listed, and also maybe 2 or 3 of your top artistic endeavors. And that is one of the things that sprung out of the Stone Arch Festival, which I got involved with because I'm a poet, and I've run since middle of '95. I started the Uptown Poetry Group, and it's, as far as I know, the longest continuous poetry group of its kind. It's open for people of all levels. We're not a closed group. There's a group called the Northfield Women's Poets that has been meeting, I think, for 20 consecutive years, once or twice a month, but they vote on who gets to be in their group. We're an open group. You can come in. We're a critique group in that we're not handholders. You know, I believe if something's bad, someone should be free to say this sucks. Also, you know, it's not a self-help group. A lot of poetry groups, I've been in a few both in New York and Minnesota, that's what they are. People getting over alcohol abuse, or their mother beat them, or their father was a dope fiend or something, and they write about that, and that's fine, and we can take that in this poetry group, but we're going to approach it as art rather than therapy. So that's basically the 2 major things I'm involved with. Maybe in '99 I'll also do the Stone Arch thing again, but those are the 2 major things I'm involved with. The website for the wall, one of the things that I put at the end there is a disclaimer, because sometimes I know I've been involved with people in the arts are very touchy, and as I take no responsibility. If you go out with someone and she turns out to be a tramp, or he turns out to be a psychotic, I don't want to hear about it. So you take your own chances and learn to live with it.
Actually, you don't mind hearing about it.
I don't mind hearing about it, but as long as I don't get subpoenaed.
But you had also mentioned, early on when you told me about the list, you had said another reason for it was that you were tired of the disciplines forming cliques within the disciplines. Well,
and this will get something that I guess I'll get into later, is, you know, certainly in a perfect example, in '97 when I was doing the first Stone Arch Festival that I did, I went around trying to sign up people, and the Artist Quarter, which is a weekly poetry reading in downtown St. Paul, I went there, the young woman, Paula Shashevsky, who runs that reading, and I told people about it. I gave out some flyers. And then I went about 4 blocks away on Robert Street. There's this place, off the top of my head, I forget it. It's a guy who owns it's a chicken fry place, and next to it is a bar that Sassy, S-A-S-E, had started a poetry series there, and they were also having a poetry reading the same night, and I went out there. The odd thing about it was, at the artist quarter, there were about 30 or 40 people gathered for poetry, and all but one of them were black, or were white, rather. There was one black person and about 30 plus white people. I went just 4 or 5 blocks away to this other reading, and I was the only white person there. And it's the kind of thing that really is irritating. I mean, certainly I'm aware of the history of the country and whatnot, but one would hope that artists, be they poets or painters, would congregate out of their mutual interest, not what they perceive as their something you don't have control over. I mean, I've never understood, for example, I'm proud to be Polish or something. I can't help it. You know, I'm a white male with bad eyesight and from New York. These are things I had no control over. What I have control over is what I produce artistically. And, you know, one of the things is people, arts, be they dance or architecture or painting or photography, it helps bring stuff into my poetry, you know, and you try to be as diverse as possible. People are too insular, and that's one of the things that hopefully this eventually will help break down. I mean, I've got my own sort of Stalin-esque 5-year plan for it. If after 5 years it doesn't get to a point where nothing's really happening, then, you know, I'll probably discontinue it. But at least then I can say I tried it for 5 years. And it's probably something, and like with the poetry group, is that you know, you read about the, you know, Algonquin Round Table. Not that there were any great artists aside from perhaps Dorothy Parker in that group, but you know, there's so little time that people put forth positive effort. Even in the whole arts, most of the time you go to a reading and it's a bunch of old ladies writing about their dead husbands or baking bread, or it's young kids with mohawks who grew up in a diner talking about how the man screwed them, and it's kind of silly and pointless. And if you come to, for example, like the poetry group, the Uptown Poetry Group that I started, I mean, there have been people that have come and gone a handful of times, and there are, other than myself, there are like 3 people who are fairly regular. Don Morse, who Dylan has filmed, a fellow named Bruce Ario, and a fellow named Greg Degestrom, and they, you know, the talent ranges. You know, someone like Don is a very polished, very knowledgeable guy. Bruce is a recovering addict who is very religious, but yet he's quite open-minded. And Greg Degestrom is someone who's had, you know, some psycho-emotional problems, but his poetry has improved vastly. He's probably, if I were to pick the one person in the group that I can say, I mean, when I met him about 4 years ago, he was writing 3rd-rate Emily Dickinson, or maybe 8th-rate Emily Dickinson doggerel, and he's actually one of the handful, maybe the 7 or 8 people I can say there's at least one good or one great poem that he's written. They come to a group, and if someone says, you know, that metaphor was not good, line 17, blah, 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 then that person, they take umbrage, and you can see they get red in the face, and they'll come back, and even if you bring in, you know, a great Whitman-esque or Robert Frostian type poem, they'll just attack, and it's so obvious. I remember there was a young black woman, I forget her name, who also came one time. She came one time to the group. She was from Philadelphia, and she, you know, told about her MFA and whatnot, and she was a very mediocre writer, a very PC, lofty type writer. And I remember I talked to her after the first group, and surprisingly she thought highly of me, but she had things against both Bruce and Greg there, that you know, why are you catering to these inferior writers and whatnot? And well, there were all levels of writers. That, I mean, I'm not, you know, I learned from bad writers too. This obese blonde woman who was very insecure, who wrote a typical kind of, I'm sitting in a cafe writing a poem about writing poems poem. And she alienated most of the people there because she was very insecure and attacking. And I brought this poem called A Sky Too Wide, An Earth Too Deep, about the Little Bighorn fiasco, Custer and all. And it was a good poem, but I was having trouble with it, and she made an offhand comment, well, what if you told the poem from the future. And it was just an offhand comment. But I took that comment and I broke the poem up, reworked it time-wise, and because I was still open, despite her 2 or 3 hours of spewing ignorance, I was still open to listening to a good idea or any idea. The poem was better. Few people do that. They shut off. So many times I've been to a group, I'll bring something in, or not even just a group, of reading, and it might be a violent poem, might be a poem about being in a gang, it might be a poem about a serial killer, and someone will say, "Oh, you're terrible. How can you write about that? You're encouraging them." And they'll shut off to anything you want to say. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at the Hungry Mind listening to Nadine Strassen, the head of the ACLU. She had a book called Defending Pornography. And there was this blonde woman in her early 30s who was at this reading, very attractive woman. She told about how her husband forced her into 4 years of prostitution, and how her husband made her perform acts of fellatio and etc. on people, and she was saying, "You can't defend pornography," and she wouldn't let this Strassen woman talk. So when they were taking questions, I got up and I told this woman, I said, you have to take responsibility for your own actions. If you chose to be with this man who then lured you into prostitution, that's your problem. If you're an alcoholic, that's your problem. You can't say that you can't write about these kinds of things simply because you're not emotionally mature enough to deal with them. But this is one of the things with art in general. And while I'm mentioning the Hungry Mind, a fellow that used to come quite often. Here's another thing. Often you have jealousies. Now, I'm a very good poet, and I've gone to poetry groups, and a lot of times you get people who, because of whatever reasons, this young woman that I like, who I recently asked out, I guess I can mention her, Chrissy Mitchell. I remember talking to her a week or so ago and saying that I'm sort of like a human barometer or a human mirror. Someone who's confident, they're gonna like me because they'll see themselves reflected. Someone who's unconfident, someone who doesn't like themselves for whatever reasons, is going to get that reflected, because I'm not going to enable someone. I'm from New York. Out here in the Midwest, if people don't like you, they'll smile for 6 months and then stab you in the back. Whereas in New York, they'll just tell you to drop dead. I enjoy poetry. When I see someone who has written a great poem, sometimes this Greg Clark brought in a great poem, it excites me, because to me it's like there's another way to heaven. I think it's the Taoist philosophy of Buddhists, there are many paths to heaven, and if I read a great poem, whether I'm pulling something and it's a Rilke, or it's a Shakespeare, or it's a Whitman, or it's a Plath, if it's a great poem, it tells me there's a way to greatness, there is the way to the high, and it gives me ideas. I don't feel threatened by that. But some people do, because I think they have this notion that there's greatness is out there, that they have either because of religious or philosophical beliefs, they believe that divine inspiration, which we've argued about sometimes, that if someone else plucks down a great idea or a great poem, there's less up there for me. So they get this feeling that if you do something great, you're taking something from me, which is an asinine notion. But this is the only thing that I can think of why there's such jealousy between artists. I mean, stand-up comedians are notoriously backbiting. Poets are as bad or worse. I'm sure painters and sculptors have the same thing. But this is often why these groups don't work out, because people have jealousies, and there's no reason for it. And so that's a good example. I think poetry or artistic talent is sort of like developing the speech pattern. If you don't learn how to speak, if you don't learn language by the age of 5 or 6, you're going to be basically a deaf mute. And I think if you don't develop your artistic gift by, at the very latest, 25 or 30, you'll never reach that full potential you have. And this John Layton is someone like that. The poem that he read was about 2 minutes, and he spent 10 minutes explaining it. And that's generally a tip-off that the person doesn't believe in their art. If you have to spend 10 minutes explaining a 2-minute poem, that's a tip-off. And the 6 or 7 other...
Well, you'll do it for historical value.
Yeah, well, this woman who had come once or twice then started to talk about his poem, and he kept interrupting her. And after about the 5th or 6th time that he interrupted her, I said, okay, Dave, just zip it for a minute, let her finish her thought, and then go on and, defend your poem to her. And this apparently was the last straw for him, that I told him to zip it. Meanwhile, this woman might have been alienated by him because she's not been back to the poetry group. So driving home, I drove him and this Bruce Ariel home, and he claimed that I turned the poetry group against him and blah, blah, blah. And he just went off on one of these risks. People sometimes have a need to be accepted. You know, I've often thought, and this Dave is a very mediocre talent. There's a Woody Allen film called Interiors that he filmed in 1978 with Diane Keaton, plays a poet, and her youngest sister, the middle sister in there, is someone who's intelligent, and there's a line that the Keaton character says about her middle sister named Joey, that Joey has all the angst and agony of an artist, but none of the talent. And that's what you find a lot of times, especially with these groups, with the SASEs and the lofts that exacerbate these poor, deluded people that are getting over being incested or getting over an alcoholic mother or a boyfriend that cheated on them or whatnot. And I don't do that. But these are people that operate out of fear. And, you know, for many years, I've just, you know, taken it because, you know, I can handle it. You know, I'm not a bully. But it gets back to the thing about poetry. You know, Dylan, you've mentioned many times with the list that when someone you know, I'll get maybe 3 or 4 people, and I'll call you and say, I want to add these, and 3 of the 4 people list themselves as poets after, you know, I'm a lace maker, a video artist, and a poet. I'm a dancer, a choreographer, and a poet. And, you know, truth be known, we know they're not poets. You know, people, and it surprises me that poetry is always held out as the highest of arts, because I think people know it instinctually. When someone talks about a Scorsese or a Kurosawa, they call them poets. They don't say, oh, they're painterly like Van Gogh. They'll say they're a poet, because people, that is the standard.
Well, they mistake poetry for poetic.
Mm-hmm.
Their films may be poetic,
mm-hmm.
but it's not poetry.
Yeah, but the point is they use poetry as the comparison because it is the highest of arts. You know, they don't say, well, I mean, you could think
of... Just a question for you. You had earlier mentioned that, or asked the question, was the world better off with an Einstein? You said yes. So answer the question. Is the world better off with a Dan Schneider?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, but I mean, that's not going to be proved until, you know, until maybe 50 years, 100, 500 years. I mean, I can look, you know, at all these books and I can say, well, I'm better than all of these writers, but I wish I could do this like him. And like I said, so, I mean, I know that given enough time, and I've often said it to my best friend Joe, is that what frustrates me is that I've had such a difficult time with young women in the arts here, but in 100 years I can just see there'll probably be some young girls in some college dorm just oohing over it when they read my collected love poems or something. Oh, why aren't there men like that anymore? Well, I'm here, but it doesn't do me any good now.